All right. Once again, talking with Peter Jordan. It's part six, and we were planning the last time, just last year, well, on December 14th, we were talking, we were planning to talk about the cattle mutilation phenomena and such, and we kind of got diverted into other conversation. There's so many areas to cover, so much to talk about, and Peter's vast experience and all of this. Sometimes we don't know quite where to begin and where to end. So anyway, we're going to be talking about the altered stakes, as my friend Greg Little called them. They're the cattle mutilations and some of the oddball phenomena that happens in association with them. We've been talking a little about this prior to starting up the recording, and we'll probably cover some of the ground we just talked about. But anyway, uh, years ago, there, I guess back in the 70s, maybe the 80s too, Peter was very involved in all that. So I'm going to just let him take it from there.
Yeah, Brent. Yeah, and thanks for inviting me. To share all of this. Um, eh, I probably should have, you know, written more about this particular subject of cattle mutilation. It was something I don't know why it grabbed me the way that it did. Um, but it did. It took a hold of me, and it's like one of those subjects that it takes hold of you, and it just doesn't let go. It's just I think because. In fact, I know it's because of this. Whereas all of the other things that I've ever investigated, whether it was poltergeist hauntings, out of body experience, the survival phenomenon that, you know, I was always passionate about, that I had looked into a great deal. Um, and and unlike a lot of these UFO sightings or even abduction experiences, um, which very often, weren't experienced by anybody but the abductee themselves. So you're just relying on that person's memory, and sometimes it's a truncated memory, and then the only way to fill those gaps in is through some sort of hypnotic recall. And I know we've talked about that. And
Hmm.
so then it becomes sort of this, ephemeral thing that's interesting, and but you just nothing that you can grab onto. I mean, unless it's you find some changes in a soil, that doesn't absorb water like it should, that kind of thing that Ted Phillips was looking at, back in the day. um,
Hmm.
Other than that, or somebody's left a mark on their skin, or there's some triangular thing burnt into their abdomen or whatever. All of that is fascinating, and I guess we could look at it as accompanying evidence, attendant evidence, but not really something, again, completely tangible. The mutilations, on the other hand, I thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. Okay, here we have like a 1,000-pound bull, right? That's somehow tranquilized and left in front of
Hmm.
a rancher's home, within earshot of all these dogs that they have, that usually snarl and bark at anything that comes around, and that doesn't happen, right? And then there's the cow on its haunches, hands up in the air, no sign of struggle. That's number one, just bizarre, right?
Hmm.
Um, Very often exsanguinated, or at least no visible signs of blood that you would expect in a situation like that, right? Um, and no footprints, nothing, sometimes just a weird, like something that looks like some tar that's left on the side, that turns out to be some sort of petroleum distillate. Again, what is that? We don't know what that is. Um, and then the way that they call them mutilations, but mutilations really isn't the apt description on many of these. We know we're talking about what appears, at least on the surface, to be some sort of surgically precise operation that's taken place, in which you're coring out the rectum, removing the reproductive organs, often one eye. Why one eye? I don't know. And it's often the eye that's up, not down. So it's like, wow, why didn't the predators chew on that? That's soft part of the animal is usually what the predators will go after. But no, in many cases, predators are completely avoiding the carcass. You add all those things together, right? And you say to yourself, well, if this isn't going to be proof that there is something extraordinary that's linked in some way to the many of the UFOs that are seen in the area at the time, I don't know what is. But
Well,
again,
yeah,
you
I
know,
know. I interviewed Chris O'Brien
yeah,
years back, and of course he lived in the San Luis Valley for a time and interviewed numerous witnesses. And in the interview, he was telling me of a real head scratcher where there was like a nearly 2,000-pound bull in this
yes,
small adobe building that
right,
that in order to get it out, they had to take down a wall.
right,
They couldn't figure out
right.
how on earth it got in there, how anybody could take it in there and just leave it, And he said that was
Well, you know what? I think that was done by David Copperfield. Um, yeah, you serious, when you think of things like that, you say to yourself, unless there's some incredible magician, that they have on the payroll, like David Copperfield, who says, I know a way to get the cow in there and no one will know how it got in there. And then it'll be hysterical. All these ufologists, all these Fortean people, they're going to say, oh my God, this is definitely the sign of something happening, but we'll know what the real answer is. I'm being facetious, but by the same token, I don't know
Yeah.
how would that even be possible, And, again, at the time this is when I first learned of it. I was reading, as I often did do, as we all did at that time, I was reading UFO Saga Report.
Yeah.
And it was an article, I think it was like 1979 or so. And there was one article, I forget who the author was, having to do with the mutilations, and it was focusing on the Gomez Ranch in Dulce, New Mexico. And by the way, at that time, I knew nothing about the lore of Dulce. I mean, I remember seeing things and I thought it just looked to me like be very sensational. The Dulce papers and all that. I never even bothered with any of that. That
Yeah.
was so far out of my, like, I thought this, how can we trust somebody or somebody called Commander X or, I don't know. And I thought, now that's the kind of thing Tim Beckley likes to promote. I'm sorry. That's not for me. So I didn't really know much about that whole thing about the underground bases at Dulce with the aliens fighting, and all
Mhm.
that. Knew nothing about that at that time. Okay. So I read this article with great interest. I said, this is absolutely fascinating. And I started digging in, I started reading more. And I think one of the first things I found or somebody had posted was an article that was written by Ed Sanders, who had written the book The Family about the Manson murders. Okay. And Ed Sanders also was somebody whose name was familiar to me because I knew that he was also one of the members of the group The Fugs. Uh, they used to play in Greenwich Village in New York and so forth and so on. He was a poet, kind of a gonzo poet at the time. And so I read this article, and I think it was in We Magazine, one of these men's magazines, and it was about his investigation into the cattle mutilations. And he, of course, linked it to what he believed was a study of chem-bio warfare. Okay, that Clostridium, which was being stockpiled at the time by the government, uh, uh, felt was being injected directly into a lot of these cows, and that's why very often you would hear that the death had been ruled as something caused by Clostridium bacterium, infection, which apparently is very common with a lot of cattle. And so, but he believed that that was actually being injected, that there was evidence of that was being injected into the animal and causing that.
Yeah.
And so these projects were black projects because Nixon had outlawed chemical bio warfare at the time. So he made a very good argument for that being a possibility with some of these mutilations. So at the time, I had not made a decision either way. Something that has continued even more ferociously to the present. I don't know. I do think, and I'll get into that in a little while. I do think that a good portion of these, I think, are terrestrial. Okay, I think some could be due to cults. I do think some. I think some could be due to some sort of black project or projects that might involve a host of different countries, not just our own, that are very black projects, very well funded, and that might have multiple purposes to them. It might not just be one purpose. Okay. Obviously, if there's something being done terrestrially, you have to say to yourself, there's a lot of risk involved in this, not just expense, but a lot of risk, right? And being, discovered, being unmasked, risks that you're going to be shot at, right? If you're running in these helicopters and so forth and so on, you got a lot of angry ranchers out there that won't hesitate, to shoot, first, ask questions later, right? So there's a lot of risks involved. So the payoff, therefore, would have to be enormous, right? The payoff would have to be enormous. So what would that be? Well, again, we can speculate on that. But going back to my interest at the time, I wasn't sure what it was, but I figured, well, the first place I'm going to start is I'm going to look into this more. So I did more and more research, and I started reading more about these mutilations that were ongoing on this ranch in New Mexico. And I figured, wow, I should really find out more about that. And somehow, that's what, I got in contact with Gabe Valdez, who was a police officer that was spearheading the investigations into the cases that were in the Dulce area, and spoke to him. Found him very credible, found the research really good. He was very down to earth about what he thought. He was absolutely convinced this had nothing to do. He is not somebody who ever believed in paranormal aliens or anything of that sort. He absolutely believed that this was a project. He said he had evidence of it, and that for certain reasons they were focusing on that particular part of the of Dulce, and coming back and repeatedly taking cows from the Gomez herd and mutilating them, then dropping them back, and then doing another one the following year, usually in the spring around the same time. Again, for you to be doing that takes tremendous amount, shall we say, of bull testicles to come back to a site that you were already at, right? And do it again. And to what hubris is it that leads you to think, wow, I can do this again and no one's going to catch me? That's amazing, right? And to have that kind of technology, to have that kind of ability to be able to do that. So I thought, wow, I should really see if I can do an article on this. And who would I do it for? So I started making phone calls to different people that were involved. And I remember I talked to, I got a little bit disappointed right from the start about, I said, I don't want to just publish this like in a UFO magazine. I really want to do something more scientific, and I want to publish this in something a little more reputable. I'm sorry to say, and something that would be read by a large portion of people, including scientists and other people. So maybe I'm all about getting other ideas from people, even outside of the particular field, that what they think this could be, or getting it from people that are involved in the aeronautical, industry or aerospace industry that might know something about silent helicopters, because at the time I remember people saying there's no such thing as a silent helicopter. They all make noise. There's all prop wash. So I thought, okay, I don't know enough about a lot of this. It would be nice to have a veterinarian pathologist or somebody who's really skilled in that kind of thing, or educated in that, that actually with bona fides that could say, no, this could be why the cow died, or this could be, and it could look like a mutilation or an operation, but it's not. I was very open to that too. So I started making calls, and I remember I talked to one guy, I forget Dan, I forget his last name, but he was a he was doing a he was going to do he was hired to do a photo essay for Life magazine about the cattle mutilations, believe it or not. It was going to be a big spread. And so they sent him out to give him a big budget, and he actually would go up in helicopters, and where there were mutilations, he would take photographs. And these photographs were some of the most aesthetic photographs I had ever seen. I mean, they weren't bloody looking, they just really beautiful photos that he took that were going to be part of this. And then there was an essay that accompanied it about this mystery that was going on. And he told me that he worked on that for quite a while, and then it was ready to go to print. And all of a sudden, one of the editors, for whatever reason, told him, "We're just killing the article. We think it's too controversial." So they pulled it. And he was so infuriated with that and so disappointed in that, that he said to me, "Listen, you sound like you're really gung-ho about this. You're really interested in this. Would you like the photographs? They're yours. You do whatever you want with them. I'm going to send them all to you," which was really great of him. So he sent me all the photos, and I still have them. So, but I thought, well, that's weird. Why would they kill the article? And I asked him, I said, was the article biased or anything? He goes, no, no, no. The article was just saying there's a mystery on the plains, and here's what's happening, and nobody seems to know what it's all about. And here's different theories as to what it could possibly be. Some of it being cultist, some of it being some sort of government project, some of, military, looking at radiation, and then the ET thing. But it was balanced between all three, like nobody knew, right? So I thought, well, what's so bad about that, right? Then I find out that 2020, on what was it, on ABC at the time? 2020, they were doing an expose of it, and who was it? Dave Marish. Do you remember Dave Marish? He had a beard. He was one of the commentators. Well, anyway, he was in charge of this, and he worked on this for 4 months. All right. Again, big budget, sent him out in the field. He went crisscross throughout the country, talking to various people, came to the conclusion that it was more than likely that this was something being done by some paramilitary or military group in conjunction with federal agencies, and that it was being done to look at, chemical warfare agencies and testing for that and this type of thing, and illicit activities, and that this was all illegal, et cetera, et cetera. I come to find out that at the last minute, they pull the plug and tell them you can't do that. And apparently they had received a call from somebody telling them to back off. And that was the end of it. Never got to watch it. Never was released. It was put in a canister and filed away. And that was the end of that. And I thought, wow, that's really unbelievable. So then I started putting together my piece, and I started making calls. And before I would even send it out, I would just send letters. So I sent a letter to the editor of Penthouse magazine, Playboy magazine, right? And I got letters back basically saying, no, sorry, not really interested. And Penthouse said, yeah, this isn't a subject that we think our readers would be interested in looking at. Good luck with your research, that kind of thing. 1 month later, I get word that there's an article in Penthouse magazine on the cattle mutilations written by a debunker from CSICOP, one of the CSICOP members, Committee for the Investigation of Claims Paranormal, which maybe some listeners will know, some people don't know, but at the time that was comprised of people like Philip Glass, who was a UFO debunker, and James Randi, the magician, and he was one of those people. And basically what it said was that all the cattle mutilations were misinterpretations of natural predatory activity. I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Right after they tell me that their readers aren't interested in this and that's why they're killing it, right?
Yeah.
That's why they're not doing it or passing on it. So all of this in quick succession, I thought, well, this is really strange. Why isn't anybody allowed to publish something on this? They never stopped anybody before. So I don't remember exactly when Linda Howe came into the picture. Um, but I think by then, trying to remember exactly, but when did A Strange Harvest come out? Was that in 1980 or 90, or was it?
I'm thinking latter part of '80s, maybe.
Okay, so that came, yeah, that came after, because I don't ever remember talking to her. I would have talked to her, I would have reached out to her, I would have been in communication for sure. So I didn't know anything about that until later. But I remember later when her book came out, I thought, well, how come she's able to do a special for HBO on this subject? And then I thought, is it because she's pointing in the direction of it being aliens and everybody's okay with that? You know, um, I wondered, you know. Uh,
Mhm.
so I go to Science Digest and they said they're interested. They set up an interview. They want to meet me, so I go in. At first, they weren't sure because of I guess I didn't have the right pedigree. I didn't have any major publications. All my articles were in, small little magazines like Fate and so forth and so on. So, but they said, we like your approach, and yeah, definitely, let's do this. So I started working on it, and then they assigned, because they said that because I hadn't, um, had a background, a sufficient background as a journalist. They were assigning another writer to like look over my shoulder and sort of edit things, and no problem. So that we go back and forth. I go back and forth with this other writer, rewrites parts of it and so forth and so on. I mean, he's not changing anything. He's not censoring anything I'm writing. And um, suddenly, about 2 weeks later, I get a call from the editor saying, "Yeah, we're sorry. I'm really sorry about this, but we're not going to be able to publish this."
Hmm.
And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we we just think there's a little bit too much controversy." And this is the way he put it. He said, "Yeah, we received some pushback on this." Now, I didn't get into the details. I don't know what that means, pushback. I don't know if that meant, with the staff, or if he meant
Mhm.
from an outside agency. I don't know. He didn't say. I thought it was odd. And he goes, but, I'm going to send you a check full amount today. So he sent me, it was like $1,000, which at the time to me was a lot of money to get
Mhm.
for an article. Right. And, uh, and I thought, wow, isn't that strange? Isn't that strange? Like everybody's got articles killed
Yeah, you
on
would
this.
think after spending, writing you a check for 1,000, they'd at least want to use some of it.
Nothing. I thought that was just really weird. And I thought, well, are they going to pull the same thing?
Mhm.
Is are they going to publish another article from somebody who's going to debunk it? You know, but that didn't happen because I had a subscription to Science Digest for
Mhm.
many years. Uh, I wrote to Omni magazine, and
Yeah,
they
they
had
were they were a good one.
yeah, but they had no interest in the topic whatsoever. They said, if you have other topics that you would like to pitch to us, we would certainly be interested in hearing about them. I thought, why wouldn't you be interested in this? I, and I thought, well, maybe I'm biased. Maybe I just think it's fascinating, but I would think, cows, all these things are happening to cows, regardless of the explanation. Isn't it worth discussing it? Or, you know, uh, I just thought that was very strange. So, anyway, um, Science Digest. Oh, I forgot this part. So Science Digest, yeah, before I started working the article, they sent me in advance so I could to pay for my airfare and everything so I could go out to Dulce. So not only did they pay for the article, they paid for my way to go out there.
Yeah.
And I ran out to New Mexico. I was there for over a week and I met with Gabe Valdez and got to see Dulce, New Mexico. Fascinating, fascinating. And got to talk to some of the Jicarilla, Apache Indian that lived there as part of the tribe and everything. And just remember thinking, wow, look at that. I would watch them, some of the elders walking around, and they would have beautiful shirts on, like silk shirts and beautiful pants and attache cases like this. And I thought, what's in that attache case, And I thought, well, good for you. Finally, you're making money and you're doing well here. That's about time. But when you have certain biases in your mind, I'm thinking Amerindians, they're all poor, you know. But I went there and I thought, I don't know about the rest of them, but some of the people here got some money, Where'd that money come from? I don't see a casino nearby, but it was just a thought at the time. I thought, oh, So that area up there too, the Archuleta, the Mesa and all that, is a very well-known Strategic Air Command playground, right? Helicopters have been seen there for years and years and years. And commando, people coming with black suits and helmets and all that, doing war games and stuff's flying up there. So strategically, that's a very, very important place, And I was told that numerous times by people, how important that area is to the government, not just for what's above ground, but what's underground, meaning mineral deposits and everything else. And God knows if there is an underground base there. I personally believe that there's plenty of these DUMBs, what do they call them? Underground bases that are scattered throughout the country. Why wouldn't you have bases? And I'm not talking alien bases. I'm talking for us, for, the government, if they want to conceal something. I mean, why wouldn't you want to move down? What, in the event of a nuclear holocaust, where is Dick Cheney going to go? He's right? Remember when he disappeared after 9/11? Boom, he went down. There was one right outside of Washington, supposedly, where they send the president and everyone else. Sure. So I'm sure by now, and people say, well, how would they have gotten that technology to be able to drill like that? Well, obviously they haven't done their research. There's patents that were there in the 50s for exactly that kind of technology. I can only imagine how much better that technology is now. Right. So to me, I thought, well, that's interesting. And that's when I first started hearing about, it's alleged that there's these, now Gabe Valdez and the Gomez family that I interviewed, they had no appreciation for that kind of theorizing, To them, this was an invasion of their privacy, and it was being done by somebody within the military or the government and for nefarious purposes. Okay. And they were infuriated by it. And they were also suffering numerous losses. I mean, you're talking about some of them being their prized bulls, so
Yeah.
you're talking thousands and thousands of dollars that they would lose, and then every time you file a claim with your insurance company, your insurance rates go up, just like with your car if you have an accident or whatever. So a lot of them were being hit hard, not just emotionally and psychologically, but financially. So I spent a lot of time talking to them and found out that many of these animals, Gabe had like this book just filled with photographs of all of the cows, all the animals, how they had been found, very detailed notes on every case. I mean, very, very, very impressed. I was very impressed with all of that. And no matter what they did, though, to try to catch these people in the act of doing it, they couldn't do it, you know? I mean, in some cases, you know, they would be on the scene, you know, where the cow was down and now they're having, you know, they're investigating it, or there's a veterinarian looking at it. They leave, and then 20 minutes later, they come back and there's another one. So in these short little windows, um, animals are being taken, these mutilations are taking place, they're coming back, they're dropping the cow. I mean, it's just crazy, you know, how
Yeah.
it's being done. And to say that it's predators, um, certainly there are numerous cases in which probably it is predator damage, you know, certainly in a lot of the cases, I think. And Chris O'Brien, by the way, I don't consider myself like the expert on the subject. It deserves this deserves mention that Chris O'Brien and David Perkins, a name that a lot of people probably don't know. Some do. Anybody in the know knows who David Perkins is. But David Perkins was one of the first people to actually go out and investigate these cases. You know, this is before Linda Howe. You know,
Mhm.
Linda Howe uh, showed Chris O'Brien the proper way to uh, get samples, you know, so forth, and you know, for the forensic research. Uh, and but Chris and a lot of those people, you know, were doing these investigations very early on. Chris was one of the first people that I knew of that investigated the lady case, Snippy as it's called. But he was one of the first people to talk to the Burrells and to look into that. So he is very knowledgeable, and anybody who really wants to know everything that we know so far about cattle mutilations really is urged to read his book, Stalking the Herd. So Stalking the Herd, which is encyclopedic, um, is a book that covers the entire thing from the very beginning when it was mostly rustling. So in the very beginning, like in early 1970s or so, there was a lot of pig rustling, animal rustling, and animals were being shot. So they would find bullet wounds in the animals. But the
Mhm.
phenomenon kind of morphed from that into like from 1970. So 1975 is when you get a lot of the choppers. A lot of the mystery chopper phenomenon starts from like 75 on. And then also from that point forth, you know, you have it changes and sort of morphs from like rustling to actual mutilations where the animals, you know, surgically precise operations are being conducted. So there's these changes that take place. Are they separate from one another? I don't know. You know, it's possible. Are they connected? I don't know. Um, could be. But you know how this goes. It's sort of where everything sort of melds together, right? And
Mhm.
then we've talked about this, and you're trying to pull something away from something else, but that thread brings all these other threads with it. You can't get just one thread. And I think Fortean phenomenon is like that.
Mhm.
At least that's been my experience. It's perplexing and it's it's infuriating sometimes because you want to be able to sort it out. This is connected to that. This is linked to this, but not to that. You can't say that in a lot of these cases, you know? So for me, I was just focusing for the purposes of this article was going to be mainly on the Dulce case. Um, but I walked away from that thinking, I don't know what this is. There's something that told me I don't think this is alien. This doesn't feel that way. Now, I know that's not science. That's just your gut talking to you. Um, Maybe I didn't want to think it was alien because it just seemed to me that if you're finding clamp marks on the back of a cow's legs, where apparently it's been hoisted up into the air and then dropped, right? Is that alien? I don't know. I mean, when has somebody come back, you know, from an abduction and said, "Oh my God, look at these marks on my ankles." I think I was hoisted up into a helicopter, people have these other little marks on them and so forth and so on. But you know what I'm saying? I mean, if you look at a cow and you see that, you say, well, I'll be damned. I mean, that sure looks like, it was hogtied and then lifted into a chopper. And why all these choppers? You know, I know Linda Howe later came to say, oh, well, the UFOs disguise themselves as choppers. And I know when I had conversations with John Keel about that, Keel said, well, there were numerous times that I would see objects morphing into other objects, in Point
Mhm.
Pleasant. He said, so that can happen. And he goes, and I've seen it where you see where he's had witnesses, he said, who would see something that looked like a silver uh, craft, like a chopper, and then all of a sudden it would spin and it would become something more circular or would take on a totally different shape. So we do have shape shifting in with UFO perceptions. I don't know if that's because the object changes and then the sun glinting off of it um, transforms it into something else perceptually. You know, I know I'm being kind of nitty about that, but we don't know if that's part of it. I don't know if that's what it is. Um, but really, all these choppers are really UFOs in disguise. Really, I don't know.
Well, I know when I corresponded with Tom Adams back in 1970, starting in 1970, and that
Right.
was when him and excuse me, some college students, friends of his from Paris, Texas, went to San Luis Valley and they were interested in the Snippy case, so they were one of the first really to start delving into that and then other mutilation. In fact, Tom Adams produced a periodical called Stigmata, as you know, a newsletter back in the day. But they were being told about the huge amount of UFO activity that was going on. Plus, there were these smaller than Piper Cub type planes that were noiselessly flying through the valley that people thought was odd. And in fact, I have to look it up again, but Cora Lorenzen, in one of her books, UFOs of the Americas or something, wrote a report of someone out that way in Colorado coming across a small little plane with one seat in it that
Oh
just
my
sitting
Lord.
there somewhere. So, but yeah, yeah. In fact, one of them, Gary Massey, and another guy, even at one time reported seeing a strange plane that was made up, looked like of different parts, around a place in Texas that they happened to be at in 1969. Tom sent me a.
And the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear stories like that, and I remember reading, um, I don't know if it was Chris O'Brien's book or where he was talking about the Burls, um, and they were. I think it was the Snippy case where they were seeing what appeared to be like mini jets, like little jets that were flying, and they would go into the mountain. Um, and seem to
Hmm,
pass through the mountain. And I remember thinking, this sounds like drone technology. But then I think to myself, wow, 1967? I mean,
well,
now we would probably, if we saw something like that, I think the first thing most people would say is, I wonder if that's a military drone, you know, or I don't know. But back then, it's hard to believe that. It's hard to
I
believe that.
know, and I noticed that David Perkins has been very interested in Facebook posts about some of these reports of these large drones that are being seen out in Colorado, and the police have been trying to identify whose they are, thinking maybe they're
Right,
militia groups or something. But
right,
it,
right.
and I'm thinking he's looking back, maybe like back in the '70s when they had all this other unusual aircraft activity and such. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, it's just it's very strange. There were also during the mutilation, speaking of aircraft, so with the helicopters. So in addition to the copters usually being either dark green or black, um, sometimes some of them had like a star on the tail end, right? Like a white star. Um, Usually bubble glass so you couldn't see in. The choppers, very often they would see the blades rotating, but there would be no sound at all. Or in a lot of other cases, people would hear the sound of a chopper outside, go running out, but couldn't see anything. So we had quite a number of those. So you have all of, it's kind of like a mishmash of all of these different things that were happening. And, but I think for me, just hearing the stories about people with seeing all the choppers and the physicality of, uh, of the mutilations themselves, the fact that, there's these bruises on the back, indicating the cow's been hogtied, just led me to believe that it's more probable that at least this subset of cases is being done for whatever reason by the government or some other agency. Again, it could be a combination of different uh, people from different countries with different agendas, perhaps. Um, I mean, certainly the ones in Dulce did not strike me as being due to predation, and they didn't strike me as being due to cult activity. It didn't have the hallmarks of that, you know?
Mhm.
Um, and it ran on for years and years and years. It wasn't just like they had a few, they had dozens of these. Um, and Gabe Valdez's son, Greg, who was young at the time, later went on to write a book because Gabe passed some years ago. He never had a chance to really write the book that he wanted to write, but his son picked it up and took all of his notes and everything like that and wrote a book. I don't know if you ever saw that,
No,
um,
haven't.
on what was going on down there, and much of that definitely points to the involvement of this these kinds of agencies, terrestrial agencies that were involved in this. But again, I always thought at some point they're going to show their hand. If it is human, I always feel like at some point somebody will show their hand, and we'll know that it's terrestrial, and we'll know the origin of it, and we'll know what the purpose of it is, because sooner or later someone's going to take a shot, for example, at one of these choppers and bring it down. And never happened. Isn't that interesting? We have cases in which people were firing at the chopper, and then they would actually see somebody standing in the doorway of the chopper with a gun firing back at the ranchers below.
Hmm.
And Tom Adams has several stories about that in his monograph that he wrote some years ago, back in the 70s, called The Choppers and the Choppers and the Choppers. I don't know if you ever saw that. That's an amazing collection of these things, but many of those cases in there seem to involve what I think is rustling. In other words, somebody on a neighboring property or whatever that wants the land or wants the animals, trying
Mm-hmm.
to get them to leave, So some of those you say, okay, they seem crude. Somebody in a chopper, they're firing, and these are choppers that are making noises, It seems to be a different category.
Yeah.
But then you have the others, and it's just so absolutely amazing. So, you know, I remember coming back from that and thinking, this is really fascinating. I remember talking to Manuel Gomez, the father, and I said, you know what? I'm sure you've been asked all these questions before, but I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to just take a stab at this. During the mutilations or shortly after any of these mutilations, did you ever receive any, you know, phone calls, threatening phone calls or anything like that that would give you a hint as to who might not want you here or might want to take your land from you, um, and maybe try to scare you off or anything like that? And he said, it's funny, nobody's ever asked me that, but he goes, I've told Gabe this story. We were receiving a number of phone calls, and he goes, and the reason I never talked about it because it just sounds stupid. And I said, well, I won't laugh at you. What was? He says, well, I remember receiving phone calls, and it always sounded like the person calling was very far away. You know, when it's like it sounds kind of staticky and like somebody's talking to you from a distance, and the person had a very thick German accent. And I guess I smile because he says, see, I told you you would laugh. It sounds stupid, right? I go, and what did this person say? He said they wanted the mineral rights. They said we need your land. We need the mineral rights. You got to sign the mineral rights off. And he said they didn't identify themselves, and we'd like you to think about that. And he goes, and shortly after that, we got several visits, personal visits at the home by BP, British Petroleum, asking if we would be interested in leasing the mineral rights to the property to them. And we said no. And he said, and I can't help but believe that it's connected in some way. So
Wow.
I thought that was very interesting.
Mhm.
And so when you combine that with the fact too, as Gabe pointed out, that many of these cows ended up having different tranquilizing agents found in the bloodstream, like chlorpromazine, ketamine, all of these things, that it certainly didn't seem very alien to me, you know? And that's one of the things that puzzles me is we have a number of these cases, not all of them, but we have a number of cases in which it's very clear that in addition to the bruising and to the hog marks and all of that, that also we have evidence of these chemicals having been injected in the cow as possible tranquilizing agents. So what do we do with that? You know, certainly if we have somebody, if it's an alien agency, I don't think they have to resort to using chlorpromazine or ketamine or any of that in order to get the cow to go down. I'm sure they got something a little better and more sophisticated. So then you say, well, how do they take all the blood out of the cow? See, this has been another problem, is how, there's a lot of blood in that cow. How do you get it out? As Chris O'Brien has pointed out, however, in many of the cases when you would turn the cow over, the blood would come gushing out because what's happening due to gravity, it's pooling. So even though when you're looking at the wounds, you're not seeing blood, the blood has seeped down below. He's not saying in every case but in many of these cases. And he points to the fact that probably many of these cases are copycat in the sense that, not that somebody's out trying to duplicate it necessarily, but that what's happening is you're getting sort of a contagion of belief. So you have ranchers here, reporting all these weird events. It's in the newspaper, and then next thing you know, so person here, rancher here, B, right, has a death of a cow and says, "Oh my God, look at that cut! I think it's that." And even though they're experienced ranchers, that they may be falling prey to the fact that they're misidentifying things, that there's almost a sense of a panic, because you got to understand something. This is your lifeblood. Your cows, that's how you make your living. So if that's being compromised or affected in any way, you're going to be in a panic about it. And if the rancher over here is saying, look what's happened, and now they're coming back, and I've already lost 20 cows or 20 animals, I've lost all this money, and somebody suddenly has a death of a cow, right? It just keels over, and it could be due to anything, but I'm just saying normally they wouldn't pay much. They would say, oh, that's due to this or that's due to that. But now they're imposing sort of a schema onto that. It's sort of like we have the same kind of things with UFOs, right? We have a flap in a particular area. We know that, oh, these are pretty legitimate. And then all of a sudden people are reporting all kinds of things. Suddenly a balloon goes up and everyone's reporting the balloon. And they're imposing that schema on that because of the environment and because of that particular cultural set, that's taking place at that time. So how many of these are due to predation? There probably could be some. The ones that I think in Dulce, I don't think there was any evidence that any of these were due to, predatory activity. But even Gabe said in some of the outlying areas where people were reporting them, he would go investigate and he'd say, it was clear to me that this was due to predators. But they
Mhm.
wanted me to believe that no, this is a mutilation. They wanted me to set up camp here and to see if we could catch these people. You start getting a little bit of a panic, and that leads to misperception, you know. Um, so that's where everything was left with me. I thought for sure after all this time, and especially when I learned that Gabe Valdez had invested so much time into this, and had used so much manpower to actually stake out these areas, try to catch these guys when they appear, and he couldn't, and then he had a lot of the choppers would fly down and they would fly off, and they were headed up toward Colorado, and he always assumed that possibly that they were coming from here but actually going and landing, you know in Colorado, which is right across the border, by the way,
Mhm.
right near Alamosa. Okay.
Yeah.
So you say to yourself, well, it could be there's underground hangars. Um, uh, you know, Keel, Keel talked about this, and so did Ed Sanders. These big white vans that would often be seen during the mutilations, they would be on the major highways unmarked, no tags, wondering what's in these big vans, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I think John Keel
Mm.
also was reminiscing one day to me about all of these weird vans, these white vans that nobody recognized that would be driving in the area. And he wondered if they were disguised military convoys or whatever. I don't know. Um, but that was something also reported up there. Um,
Yeah,
so
that
I
was
got
reported. That was reported early on too by Tom Adams and his crew.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, he did too. And it'll drive you crazy. And again, Tom believed that the choppers were the key to understanding the mutilation mystery. He believed that the choppers were proof that there was something here, at least partially on the ground, that was involved, and that once we find out the identity of the people piloting those, we're going to get closer to this. And of course, that day never came. And poor Tom, I mean, died kind of penniless, and I
Hmm.
don't know. It's a sad story. I know he married. Didn't he marry Krista Tilton? Um,
Yeah, yeah, I
the
recall that.
abductee, and I remember. I know I was listening not too long ago to an interview with Martin Cannon on Erica Luke's show, which was excellent. I hadn't heard of uh, or heard from. I don't think anybody has Martin Cannon in years and years and years. So he came back into the fold.
Hmm.
But one of the stories he was talking about was the fact that um, you know one of the things that he's always regretted was the fact that his um, I don't know, his relationship with Krista. He was almost in tears over Krista Tilton. And the reason I'm bringing that up is I hadn't heard Krista Tilton's name mentioned in years, other than I knew that Tom Adams was married to her. And I remember reading, I think it was in one of Tom's, not in Stigmata. Remember that other one he had, Crux? Not Crux. What was,
No,
he had
Crux. Yeah, C R
was it
U
Crux?
U
Yeah.
X.
So
Yeah.
he had a couple of issues devoted to Krista Tilton. And I
Hmm.
remember reading it thinking, wow, this, I don't know about this woman. She just seems, yeah, and again, it's probably not fair to me to say I didn't know her, but it just seemed like, wow, she doesn't seem very grounded. Did this really take place? I don't know. And I was so surprised that Martin Cannon, of all people, had a relationship with her, y- you know,
Yeah.
because he was such a harsh skeptic of anything paranormal or UFO related. Um, but yet he brought it up, and I thought, well, that's really, really interesting. I don't know. And again, I don't know what happened toward the end of Tom's. I think he was working in a dollar store, and then I know Gary Busey. Yeah. Oh God.
Gary Massey.
Gary Massey. Boy, there's a bad Freudian slip. He, I think he ended up burning his own house down.
Yeah, I was reading.
And I don't know if Chris had brought that up during a
Uh,
podcast or in one of his books or
well,
somewhere.
Lauren Coleman posted a blog about their death.
How
Both
sad
Tom
is
and Gary. He shot his dog, and then he shot him. He put
how
him in his house.
unbelievable.
Uh,
And I remember when, hearing this and I thought, gosh, I'm obsessed about this, but I know when to back off of it, you know,
mhm,
and I I just got to the point where I just didn't know what to believe, and I remember coming back from that, and then I was very disheartened because the article that I had been working on, which was going to incorporate all of this, got blown away, and I thought, well, where does this leave me? I don't know. And then I thought, you know what? I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to get a group of some sensitives together, and I'm going to see what they think. And these were sensitives that I had worked with for many, many years, and I trusted them, and I thought they were pretty down to earth, and I just thought, you know, maybe if I get them to get, I'll do each one of them separately, and then maybe I'll see a consensus or there'll be some threads here or something that would be kind of helpful. So
mhm,
that's what I did. And that became an article that I wrote for 14 Time and Glimpses Through a Looking Glass. So basically what I did is I found like 4 or 5 psychics that I had worked with, and I would sit down with them and I had these slides of different photos and they would do psychometry where they would touch them and give me feedback on what was going on. So, and some of them were capable of like touching it and an early form of remote viewing. So they would say, "Oh, I'm in a desert place, and I see this and I see that." And the most amazing thing to me, for me, at the time, was that without exception, um, all of them felt that this was uh, a terrestrial. These were groups of terrestrial agencies. Many of them were very, very specific on how this was being done, that there was always 3 people. Usually they would see black, like a black jumpsuit, and one would come out of the chopper and there would be some sort of a device that they could drop near the cow and it would leave triangular marks in the soil. It would look like a UFO had
mhm,
landed. And then they would shimmy down this on top of the cow and they could do everything that they needed to do, and then they could just get hoisted back up into it and there would be no mark, there would be no footprints, it was really fascinating. And that wasn't just one person saying, then another psychic would say the exact same thing. Oh, there's no footprints, here's how they do it. One said they have balloon shoes. I don't know what these are, but you put them over your shoes, and because of where they're walking, it doesn't displace the ground. So it just looks like a tread mark, but it's actually part of a footprint.
hmm,
And they said this is all cutting edge technology. A couple of them said someone's trying out different techniques. They're testing things to see not only how people respond to it, but if it works. Like, can you go out in the field where there's an animal and actually take all the blood out of it? How do you do it? How do you do it quickly? Um, you know, Using surgical instruments, sharp surgical instruments, and in some cases, what looks like a laser that would cauterize. And I remember the conversations back then were, I did a lot of research into this. I mean, so there's no such thing. You don't have anything portable that can go out into a field, where you can just cut something. You need high heat in order to do that, you need something that would be huge, size of a refrigerator. We don't have that kind of technology. And then not long after that, I'm reading this article in a newspaper and it was about Philips, the company Philips, and they had this portable laser that you could take out in the field and it can cauterize and it can do all these. I still have the article. This is back then. That's what they're telling us that they have. What are they telling us? What are they not telling us that they have? Right? Same thing with the
yeah,
helicopters. I remember talking to Arthur Young, who was the inventor of the Bell helicopter.
mhm,
all right, and asking them, what are your thoughts about totally silent helicopter? He went into all this stuff about the wash and the rotor and how you couldn't do that, but there might be a way, he said, that you can, if you fly it low enough to the ground, it muffles the sound, but there still would be sound and there would be backwash, right? He goes, unless there's a different technology I'm not aware of. He goes, that sounds impossible. If you're telling me people are saying something and has no sound at chopper, he goes, that's impossible at this time. That's what he said,
Mhm.
But I was never convinced of that because, as you and I both know, as far as the government or the military is involved, very often these developments lag behind by, right,
20
decades. So
years. Yeah.
20, 30 years. So how do we know that, you know, they don't have this now? But, the questions that come up then is, well, then why don't we see more of this now? Like by now, wouldn't we, if we have choppers that can be silent, why aren't there tons of these silent choppers being used? So we don't have, and no backwash, you know, from the rotors. That would be fantastic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of these choppers too were seen flying in blizzard conditions. I remember that Tex Graves, who was a sheriff from Elbert County, which was an area hard hit of the mutilators back in the mid 70s, would actually see, he only not only saw like what he called Big Mama, like a mothership, and then, you know, disengaging from it these small little objects, um, that would fly around. This is right in the same areas where these mutilations were taking place. But he would also see choppers flying sometimes in blizzard conditions,
Hmm.
and they're
Wow.
not moving at all. Okay, how is that possible? You know?
Yeah. That kind of reminds me of uh, the thing you were talking about earlier, what the psychics had said about the hoisting the cattle. They actually had cases in Brazil of a number of them where people reported that these cables came down out of the UFOs, and,
Right.
and a little man would come down and try to attach a person to them, hook them, with a hook on this
Oh
cable,
yeah, I remember
and
this.
and hoist them up into the craft.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
which
so we don't know. I mean, it seems, there's parts of it that seem theatrical, and then there's parts of it that seem so grounded in our reality that it's hard to disengage yourself from it and to say, well, these are vignettes, these are paranormal vignettes, these are theatrical scenes that are being played out, and they're not real. I mean, they're real in the sense of, the damage that's inflicted, the operation, so forth and so on. But this is something that's being done in a completely different way that has nothing to do with some terrestrial agency. Um, so, just if I'm to be brutally honest with anyone else and with myself, the fact of the matter is I don't know. Um, and I remember I had a conversation with John Keel. I had numerous conversations with him during the time I was doing a lot of this research because I was really interested in what Keel had to say about mutilations in general.
Mhm.
And he talked about the ones that he um, saw, witnessed, and also heard about from other witnesses down in Point Pleasant during the Mothman um, case. And he said a lot of those were animals found on the side of the road where it looked like somebody had taken a cleaver and just cut the animal completely in half. And he said, and there were cases like this elsewhere in Ohio and so forth and so on. And I've heard of cases like that. This, and I said, but did you have any like this where everything's cored out? And he said, not as much. He said a few, but I never really looked into them. I didn't really have time to look into everything that was down there. And I heard so many things. Um, but he said there were some, but not to this, and certainly not to this extent, you know.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Yep.
so I don't know, but he called me up one day and he said to you, "Hey, I got something for you. It's a solution that I finally have the answer to your cattle mutilation mystery, and it's this book right here that I went out and bought.
Atomic Harvest.
It's called Atomic Harvest: Hanford from Washington State, that is, Hanford, Washington, and The Lethal Toll of America's Nuclear Arsenal by Michael D'Antonio. And Keel said to me, and there's a foreword by Stuart Udall, so you know it's credible. And
Wow.
so this book goes into this whole thing about, these nuclear facilities and all of this. And so I asked you, after I read the book, I said, are you saying that you think the cattle mutilations, is this what you conclude, that it's being done by somebody monitoring nuclear fallout? He said, I think most of it has always looked like it's something connected to that. So I don't think he was saying necessarily that he believed that it was all terrestrial or even ultra terrestrial, whatever, but he was saying that the connection seemed to be to this. And that goes back to David Perkins. So Perkins, I don't want to forget to bring this up, was probably the first person to point out that the majority of these mutilations seem to fall downwind from nuclear facilities. And he had a map where he plotted them all. And he put out this. I'm going to make a copy for you and send this to you, because I'm sure this doesn't exist anywhere. And it's called Proximity Relationships, Animal Mutilations, Nuclear Facilities, and Military Installations. And he makes a very, very persuasive case for at least showing that there is an absolute connection between where these mutilations took place and military installations and nuclear facilities, and they all seem to be downwind, which seems to suggest that perhaps, again, this is the great perhaps, right?
Yeah.
That what somebody is looking at by sampling these particular parts of the animals, the reproductive organs or the eye, etc., is because what they're looking for are traces or fallout from radioactivity that might be affecting animals. In particular, that they're affecting cows, the cattle. And so the cattle industry, of course, would certainly be devastated if something like this were to, wipe out a huge portion of the animal industry. So, cattle industry. I mean, we do have other animals, certainly, that have been mutilated. We even have rabbits and small animals and cats, dogs, you name it, it's been there, but the vast majority is bovine, So this still, is probably one of the few things that we could say, well, there's this correlation, and how many times do we find out that a cow has been dropped right in a Cheyenne Mountain in front of like one of the largest and most well-guarded military facilities in the world, and yet somebody just decided this would be the perfect place to drop a dead cow.
Yeah, was that
I forget exactly, but
Messengers of Deception, Jacques
Vallée. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and there's been several like that. So you say to yourself, is that a possibility? I think that could be an important clue. And then, as I mentioned, Colm Kelleher, who's famous for being a co-investigator for Bigelow with the National Institution for the Discovery of Science, NIDS, also wrote a wonderful book called Brain Trust. And actually, I learned of this book from Chris O'Brien, and this book explores the possibility that cattle mutilations are really part of some sort of covert exploration of disease linked to prion disease, which is associated with Alzheimer's. And that's why they're taking those particular parts of the animal. Again, it's because of this. And that this program started, Kelleher speculates, during the time when um, this disease was pretty rampant. I don't know if you remember the whole thing about mad cow disease, where they were actually, I think in Great Britain, they were burning
Yeah.
they were taking all the animals and they were actually destroying them because there was such a fear about this and the contamination and so forth and so on. So he wonders if this, because it seems to coincide with this occurring in the 1970s, if this is actually what was taking place. I don't know.
Interesting. So many interesting threads. One of the things in my reality checking for January, because we're talking about the mutilation phenomenon, and everything, and I keep seeing, like, recently, even in Nick Redfern's new book, Runaway Science, he talks in a section about mutilations. He talks about Tom Adams, David Perkins, um, a number of people involved in that, and it's. I know with Tom's early reports, with like the Snippy, which actually was Lady, the horse mutilation in 1967, that drew Tom and his friends into that whole area, and there were all these people who were gathering evidence from the horse, the Lady site, and even Don Richmond thought that he was looking at some of the vegetation, noticed
Right.
some
Hmm.
singed areas, and there was samples, and there were three people whose home were broken into, and the only thing taken, they claimed, was this evidence. And I think in a separate incident with Mrs. Lewis, she who was the horse owner, she had something that was broken, I guess, into a store that she worked at. She had something that was related to that, some kind of evidence too. And
Yeah. Then also with the Burls, with her, wasn't when when there was a change in ownership, the new people had
mhm,
moved in. There were these two people that suddenly showed up that nobody recognized, or you know, and they went in and they thought were part of the cleanup crew, and
right,
they
that's
supposedly, right, and they absconded with her drawings and some of the things that she had in there and so forth and so on.
yeah.
Um,
Everybody in that cleanup crew thought that they were friends of someone else's.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very strange.
And
Yeah.
then when they left, they had all looked at these journal things that apparently belonged to Mrs. Lewis, and there was descriptions and drawings of objects, and they were actually drawings of robed beings, some that had like a symbol on the thing with
Yeah.
I think it was like a snake and a triangle, and all that disappeared when these two gentlemen suddenly left, and so they attributed it to them. And even I asked Chris O'Brien in my interview, I says, "Have you had anything like that?" And he said, "I could tell you stories that would curl your toes." He said, "I've had people coming into my house when I'm gone and stealing
Yes. Yeah,
things."
I know that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of all, I mean, he certainly you would think would be targeted because Chris, um, probably, I don't know any single other investigator other than David Perkins that
Mhm.
probably holds more information and, you know, and more knowledge about this. Um,
And something else on the cabin, I found that with through Tom Adams, that there was a lot of activity, and this is in my write up too, in the January issue of Alternate Perceptions, um, that other people had strange experiences at that cabin that the Lewises
hmm.
owned. There was a Don Richmond who claimed that one night uh, he heard a sound on the roof of the cabin. He was going out the door to he was about to go out the door to investigate, and suddenly he stopped and felt he got a mental message that it was a surveying disc that struck the cabin roof, and that he needed to stay inside for, I think, like 45 minutes before he went out.
How weird.
And then later,
Wow.
he left the cabin and was told that he was not to go back for a period of time. And then after 3 months, he went back. And interesting, the Lewises felt the same need to stay away independently, and they all came back to the cabin on the same night.
How strange. That's
Yeah.
a remarkable, that's a remarkable case, a remarkable story. And as Chris has said, we've never had a case like that where an animal has exhibited the types of wounds and where you had all this other attendant phenomena at the same time. It's just really, really amazing. And that was the case where it was investigated by Dr. John Alschuler, who was a hematologist who actually came down and looked at the animal and so forth. And then he himself also had a number of UFO experiences. And he started off kind of a skeptic, but then when he saw the animal and he saw the wounds and the way the blood, I mean, he was a hematologist.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, if there's anybody that would know something about that, and he was absolutely astonished that someone could have done this. Um, and yeah, there's so many of these different types of cases that we've had, and you know, as I said, it perplexing and infuriating, and boggles the mind. And after a while, you have to say to yourself, okay, listen, I'm going to drive myself crazy and paranoid, and I don't want to end up doing something stupid and burning down a house or putting a bullet in my head or whatever, or just ending up in an insane asylum, worrying about something I'm never going to be able to solve. So you just have to, you know, pull away. And the thing that was drawing me more and more into it was this is when, and at this point, I think we talked about this. I really hadn't I'm not somebody who's into numerology. I wasn't into synchronicity or strange experience. I only had one experience, which I've talked about, which was with Dr. Schwartz, where his doppelganger called the phone. Other than that, I really hadn't had anything like that ever happen. When I got involved in the cattle mutilations, all of that changed. And I did write an article about this in a small magazine, which I think you reprinted on your site,
Yes, it did.
about me and the number 23. And basically, I won't go through the whole thing, but it was bizarre how many instances of this number, which meant nothing to me. It has no significance apart from the context in which this was happening at the time. Okay. It's not like, oh, 23, it's my birthday or the house I lived in. It had no connection to me in any other way. I didn't know what that was. So it starts appearing everywhere I'm going. And as I wrote in my piece, I said it wasn't as though I was looking for the number, rather that the number was looking for me. You know, I,
Hmm.
I don't know how to explain that any other way without making it sound like I'm absolutely insane. But until you've had that experience, it's it's very unnerving because it's again one of these kinds of what I call the bubble experience, like a UFO experience, and it only seems to happen in one space. And then, there's no cars around you on the road that's usually heavily trafficked, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah, there's nobody sharing the experience with you, or the person next to you is shut off, they're asleep. And then when you wake up, you go, you're not going to believe what happened. And no one's there to verify anything that you had. Well, it's kind of like that when you have this kind of experience, because this was private. It wasn't like I'm in the car with somebody and they go, oh my God, look at that number. What would happen is, like let's say I'm driving and all of a sudden there's a car driving too slowly in front of me. This is one example, right? And then I would honk and the car would finally pull forward. I would look down to make sure that the car is pulling forward and I would see the license plate and 23. Okay, so that's how it would start, right? And
Hmm.
then I remember I had a job at the time. I was working this company, Hertz Truck Rental. I was just doing some paperwork there for like a summer job, and I ran in and they assigned me my phone, which was number 23, and they said, "Oh, and you have a parking space in the garage, and it's number 23." So so it started there, right? And then this is not like where I'm writing it down. It was just like when I looked back, I realized all these times it had happened. And then I would check into hotels and they would give me, and this was funny. I remember being in a hotel once and they said, you're at the end, number 23. And from at this point, I was starting to get like really unnerved by it. So I said, can I move that? No, it turns out that's the only room that's available. So I was forced to be in number 23. So over and over again, it was just like crazy. So and then one of the biggest things was, I remember I was in Barnes and Noble, which I normally was in. I was reading magazines back in the day when they actually had magazines. You could sit down and just read a magazine, right? And then I walked over to where the UFO paranormal section was, and I'm just looking through the things, and I see this book, and I recognized the name, Robert Anton Wilson. I had read something, an article in 14 Times about him, and I thought, oh, he's an interesting guy. It's called The Ultimate Trigger, right? I forget the full name of the book. Cosmic Trigger. So I thought, oh, this is interesting. Let me see what it is. So I literally pulled the book down, right? I wasn't familiar with the book, and I start leafing through, and all of a sudden, oh my God, it was the Enigma of 23. It's about 23. So I sit down, I said, I got to read this. What the hell is the Enigma of 23? So it's this whole thing about William Burroughs and all these people and connected with 23 and 23, and all of these different permutations and associations with that particular number. I thought, wow, that's amazing. So I buy this book. I got to buy this book, just to read the rest of it and so forth. And a couple weeks later, I'm in the bookstore again, and I'm looking at, and there was a new, it was I don't know if it was Science Digest or if it was, I forget what magazine this was. And I remember I took this magazine down, and I opened it up, and the page it falls on is Freud and the number 23. And I remember right next to that, there was a photograph of Sigmund Freud, and embedded in his glasses, right, is the number 23. Now, the reason that's so significant for me isn't the number even, but Freud, of all things, because I had gone to graduate school. I had read everything I thought on Freud and Carl Jung and all the other psychologists. I knew of Freud's interest in the paranormal. I didn't know about his interest in numerology. I'm reading this whole article about why he thought the number 23 was important and what it might have signified. So these things started happening routinely. When I went out to Dulce, New Mexico, I'm in the airport. I'm waiting for my flight. And all of a sudden I look over, and here's a poster. And it's a poster of Michael Jordan from behind, but it's his T-shirt. It says Jordan 23. And I remembered, I said, oh, that's right. Jordan is 23. Holy mackerel. This is crazy. So it ran on and on and on. And then I was taking detailed notes of every single time that this thing happened. And I thought, what could this possibly signify? Unless, as I speculated at the time, that perhaps like Freud believed that 23 had to do with biorhythms, that it had to do, with chromosomes. 28 being for the female, 23 for, the male. And then I thought, well, maybe this has to do with DNA. And now, see, a lot of the psychics I was working with were saying this has to do with chemicals. Somebody said, I smell mustard. What's mustard gas? Okay. And then they would say DNA. Somebody's doing like where they're combining this DNA from an animal with a plant or a person. And this is hush hush. This is all underground, and this can't get out. But there's been a problem, and something now is spreading through the earth, spreading through the animal feed, and it can't get out. They can't let people know. So they use the UFOs as a cover for what they've done.
You know what just happened? I was just looking at the recording time. I was making a note of, you mentioned DNA and 23, and it's 1 hour and 23 minutes recording.
Wow. So there you go. There's a perfect example and illustration of what I'm talking about. But yeah, so after all of this, I remember I wrote the article, and I remember talking to Jerry Clark, and I said, you're not going to believe what happened. I was involved with, blah, 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 with the cattle mutilations. And he said, the cattle mutilations, he goes, that's all this, that's satanic cult groups. We proved that. We showed that. Kevin Randall, blah, blah, blah. and you got to remember, back in the 1970s, there was a thing called satanic panic, where people were blaming the devil for everything and satanic groups, right?
Mhm.
So when these things started happening, especially ufologists, a lot of ufologists wanted to put distance between cattle mutilations and legitimate UFOs, you know? So never the twain shall meet.
Mhm.
And then there were those, I remember meeting some people who were like abductees, talking to them about it. And they said, "Oh, the aliens would never do this. Aliens, they're here for our welfare. They wouldn't do it. And if they did do it, it would be for our benefit. You should leave it alone because, so everybody had like a different spin on what they thought,
Mhm.
depending upon their, set of presumptions or biases or whatever. But I remember thinking to myself, you know, when Jerry said to me, "Well, now you're going into woo-woo country," meaning you're getting into stuff like, numerology and synchronicity. And he goes, we have to stick to the science, to what he meant was the nuts and bolts of it,
Mhm.
radar, visual sightings, uh, and so forth. And that if we get off into these tangents and so forth, I think that's one of the things too that cattle mutilations became sort of discredited because there was almost like there's this like fear skepticism among a lot of ufologists about it, which is funny, like almost like you're talking about something that's just too bizarre that they can't even cope with, you know, for whatever reason. Um, Again, I think it's more to do with um, we don't want that associated with this because it's already, there's enough aspersions that have been cast on ufology. We don't need it more being dumped on it by having it through being associated with something as, incredible as this. So, in other words, that you're compounding too many things and therefore no one's going to accept it. So and there's a big giggle factor about it too. I used to find that even in my lectures, like when I would get to this subject, people would just laugh. I don't know. They just thought, because I think people see, these memes. You see the memes of a cow being sucked up into a UFO, that type of
Mhm.
thing. And so there's this feeling that, this is something, it's a fantasy or it's just somebody's imagination. It just doesn't really happen, you know? I mean, they'll buy the fact that somebody's abducted out of their bedroom and that they pass through a wall, right?
Right.
Right? Or they're taken out of their body and then they go on and then they see hybrids and so forth and so on. That's fine. But you mean they actually hurt a cow, So I don't know. It's just very, very strange. And I really thought that there would be far more people involved and actually and interested in this. And I found that most people, even in ufology or Forteana, are like, "Oh, really? What is that real? Is that something interesting? I don't know. I never really thought about it."
Yeah, I remember thinking back in the 1970s, like things I was reading in, Saga's UFO Report and Flying Saucer Review and everything that was available at that time that I saw all, Keel and Valley and the things they were saying. And at the time, of course, even Jerome Clark. I mean, it seemed like ufology was starting to take a broader perspective on things. We were moving away from just ET to some of the high strange
Yeah,
elements.
but we really didn't, because when you think about it, I mean, when you look at Kufos, so I think, well, Jerry was the editor, right? Kufos,
Hmm.
and he was friends, and his close associate was, Hynek, Alan Hynek, and you had Kevin Randall, and you had people that were um, what I would call more of the hardcore ufologists, that more skeptical, certainly very balanced, so forth and so on, and not for Tiana at all. Like at one time, Jerry Clark was,
Hmm.
a card carrying for Diana, and then sort of moved and sort of evolved and then became very conservative and then sort of like threw that away. Kevin Randall's always been sort of just focused on hardcore nuts and bolts. What is the radar? Do we have multiple witnesses? Stuff that's always was done early on. But Hynek, I think, because this is just my conjecture. I don't know. I don't know these people well enough. I know Jerry, but I didn't know Hynek well, or Vallée. But just judging from everything I've read, it seems to me that Vallée had a very important influence on Alan Hynek's thinking, especially
Hmm.
toward the end.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I don't think Clark was Jerry Clark always seemed to take exception to things that Vallée said. He wanted to engage him in debates, and he said Vallée won't. He won't even respond to my emails or my offers of trying to have a debate about what he's talking about. I think he's completely off the grid, and because I think he's just afraid to actually be confronted by someone. I think that probably uh, Hynek, I think privately always he had to have seen a lot of these high strangeness things in the
Hmm.
cases he was investigating, and chose to just sort of put them to the side. I think what Vallée was showing him was, no, you can't just throw them away. We have to explain them too. It's fine to be. Vallée's a scientist.
Hmm.
He's not an anti-science by any means, right? So, he's astrophysicist by degree, I believe. So, but what I'm saying is, Vallée realized you have to do both. It's fine to look at ground traces, all that, but also what about the individual witnesses? What else have they experienced in their life?
Hmm.
The poltergeist, the Fortiana stuff, and all that. And I think Hynek, especially toward the end, was becoming more and more convinced that we needed to look at that. And when you look at that book, what was that book?
On,
Uh,
on the edge of reality.
okay, so that book
Yeah.
sort of, crystallizes all of that. You start seeing it for sure,
Yeah. I
And I
know.
think Hynek, being a scientist and the so-called leader of this UFO movement, felt he had an obligation to other fellow scientists or people that were thinking of getting involved to keep this clean. In other words, to keep all the boundaries marked as clearly as possible, so as not to get it too confusing. And that's typical of a lot of scientists. Scientists,
Yeah.
I was kind of like that. I just felt like, that's why I just, was so opposed to hypnosis. And that's not scientific. That really isn't science. Um, I was always one that I liked to see what, like Ted Phillips was finding with the ground traces, or what
Mhm.
is the physical evidence showing us? Are there any similarities to other cases? What are the statistical relationships between these sets of phenomenon? Um, that early on, that was what was really important to me. But now, I look at it and I think, I don't know, it doesn't matter, because all those attempts at trying to do that and just be scientific and just be in the box, really what hasn't gotten us very far.
No, I
I'm not saying
remember.
the other side of it hasn't gotten us very far either, because once you open up the door to everything, then all you can say is, oh, it might be connected. Well, that doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah, and I think I told you this. I happened to be out that way around Chicago when I was in the Navy, going to Great Lakes Naval Training Academy, and uh, I called Dr. Hynek up and I visited him at his home. That was back in September 1972, and I brought up John Keel's name, and I expected. Well, what
Some
I got
pushback on that. Yeah.
pushback, and it said, no, I find his ideas quite interesting.
Yeah.
And uh, I think I think I told Keel that and he was kind of surprised. But
But why? But when you think about it, with his such a close association with Vallée,
mhm,
all those years, they were best friends. They weren't just associates, they were best friends. How could you not be influenced by that? And he respected Vallée.
mhm,
He
yeah,
admired him, looked up to him. Um, if Vallée said that he had been to Brazil and he met this family and this happened and now there's poltergeist phenomenon, I mean, I'm sure Heine couldn't sit there and say, I think you're making that up, or these people that had nothing to do with it. Maybe if that was one case, but if you start seeing this over and over again, after a while, you have to say, well, maybe my set of assumptions aren't exactly right. Maybe I need to look at, some of these other things. And I think he did privately. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know. Be interesting to hear what his son has to say about all that, what his memory is of all of that, you know?
Yeah, it would. And we're getting close to the time to wind it down here.
But we made it. We made it to the finish line. I'm
Yeah,
very impressed with myself, you
very
know?
good. Yeah. As you know, my wife has a birthday today, January 4th, and, I've got to take her out to lunch and such, and,
Oh, that's great.
celebrate that. So,
Yeah.
anyway, but yeah, we've had a very, very, very interesting conversation, Peter, and your memory of things is wow. I'm impressed how you can grasp all these names and titles and things.
Well, I have to tell you that in preparation for this, I pull out all my old notes and my things, and it jogs my memory for things that are somewhat vague or whatever. Because, after all this time, it's
Oh,
been so many years, it's hard to remember everything. That's the great thing about writing a book. Like Chris O'Brien wrote a book, and everything in there, is stuff he kept notes on, and so you don't have to sit there and fumble around and say, I don't remember who that person was. We can just look back, and
hmm
we have it for posterity. But yeah, and it's interesting too. Now I don't hear that much about. So the cattle mutilations, the impression I got too is that what happened was a lot of ranchers realized that they were going to be targeted um, as making up stories or simply exaggerating things that were going on or misidentifying phenomena. So after a while, I think this is my personal opinion that a lot of ranchers just decided to stay mum. And I had a couple of cases that came to me via the internet of some people that experienced things back in the 70s and told me uh, that they were told by their parents to, when this happened, to take the animal out in the back and bury it and don't talk about it um, because nothing good would come of it. They
yeah.
were up for ridicule. So I do think, and I think especially that happened after the Rommel report came out, like 1980, and it was basically a whitewash of the entire phenomena, linking all of it to predators. I think a lot of ranchers were inflamed by that and just said, you know what, if it happens, I'm not going to talk about it. So I think that's part of it. That's a lot big part. I can't believe that there's none. You know.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I have been thinking since our discussions that I need to reach out to David Perkins and do an interview with him as well. And
And you
see
know
what,
who else was very close with Tom Adams? Was what's his name? Ray Boucher. Um,
oh,
Roy
yeah,
Boucher. Ray Boucher.
yeah,
Boucher.
I've already talked with him about interviewing him. It was going to be about maybe the Collins Elite thing that he, talked to some government people that,
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. And also, he posted all of Tom Adams's stigmata on one of his sites,
hmm
in addition to all of the photographs of all of these cases. I was really quite impressed with that.
yeah, he's also posted all of Keel's anomaly newsletters.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So it's nice to see, but
yeah, all righty.
well, that was wonderful. Once again.
Yeah, and yeah, you're influencing me to look in various directions that I haven't yet looked, Peter. So it's this is really, and we've heard from this guy over in Germany who's also been a
Yeah.
victim of the
What
23
one
synchronicity.
last one last thing before I go, and that has to do with John Fuller. John Fuller, who wrote Incident at Exeter,
hmm
right? Which happened up in close to your neck of the woods, former neck of the woods.
hmm
Uh, apparently I read, and I don't know if you ever heard this or could look into it, I'd be interested in knowing this, that when Phil wrote that book, he included some cases of cattle mutilations that had taken place either in or near Exeter. If it is, that's a very interesting thing because that would have been 1965.
Yeah, I've heard.
Predates the snippet
Yeah,
case.
I've heard of that, but I've never, you know, I think it was might have been Philip and Brogno that of the Hudson
Oh,
Valley things that maybe said
okay,
that. I don't
okay.
know. I've never seen the evidence, um,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
a
I
copy of
just found
the
that
original
I
script.
found that fascinating,
It
because
is. Yeah.
I've never heard of any mutilations up in that area. So
Yeah, that was. Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard that too. Yeah, well, we'll have to. Maybe we can find out something about that. I don't know. But anyway,
that'd be great.
well, thanks
Well,
again, David. I mean, I'm Peter.
David, you can call me David. That's not an insult. Thinking of David Perkins? Yeah, that's fine. But tell him I said hello when you talk to him.
All right. I will
All right,
I'll definitely reach out to him.
all right.
Okay.
We'll be in touch again. You guys have a
Uh,
great day. We'll talk
All
soon.
right. You too.
All
Take
right. Take
care.
care,
Thanks
Glenn.
a lot.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye, Peter. We'll see you.